And it's the newer democracies of the world that are teaching us new ways of engagement. That's another talk, but that's where I think our inspiration will come from your societies, not from ours. And thirdly, this question is, where is policy made? Because of this rise of citizen engagement, we actually have a whole number of new kinds of participatory spaces. At the local level, over the last decade, we have huge programs of democratic decentralization. Over 75 countries in the last decade created laws for decentralization under the theory of bringing decisions closer to the people at the local level. At the same time, we have big programs of national government, but increasingly there are opportunities for participation in national policies, such as many of you will know the PRSPs, the famous Poverty Reduction Strategy papers, which we can argue about whether or not they were a real opportunity because they were captured and filled with power. But they did set a precedent by saying that poor people must be involved in the setting of policy in the national budgets that affect their lives. And thirdly, we see increasingly global level structured opportunities for global civil society to take part in decision-making processes, international consultations, treaties, conventions, summits, and the very fact that you exist as a UN-supported civil society network is showing that this is a new kind of participatory space to make decisions. So we have a shift from government to governance, from the local to the global level, with a lot of new opportunities for bringing citizens' voices, people's voices, into that process. But then we have to start talking about, well, what do we really mean? What's the meaning of this notion? And I'll use the term participation. We can use the term involvement or getting citizens' voices in the process or bringing the voices of vulnerable people in. What do we mean by this? Now, normally this takes a turn, so I'm going to give you the Twitter-eye view in about 2 minutes of the history of participation in development and policy processes globally. Because there are multiple different meanings. And it's really important to me that if you're talking about strengthening people's voices of the vulnerable, what do you really mean by that? In the development literature and history, it was really back in the 1970s that the term participation and participatory development first emerged. It was post-colonialism. We had the rise of liberation movements. We had people writing like Paulo Freire, who talked about the pedagogy of the oppressed. How many people have read that book? Okay, a good number. It's really interesting. Every time I meet students, it gets fewer and fewer, but you've got some old-timers here who remember that Freire said that participation is about moving from the voices of the silenced people to empower them to speak for themselves. So participation was a process here of taking those who had been excluded from decision-making and from resources and empowering them through their own knowledge and voice to engage directly with the processes that affected their lives. That's, I think, a sense what I read from your mission statement. But by the 1980s, we began to see things happen. We began to see the donor development agencies pick up the language of participation. We began to see NGOs emerge. We began to see NGOs speaking for people in rural communities. And sometimes in the discourse, the language changed from participation by people themselves to participation of beneficiaries of our programs. Now, I think the term beneficiary is a very different idea than participation of the excluded. It suggests that somebody is benefiting from our development and we want to allow them some opportunity to speak. But their right to speak is dependent on our presence, otherwise they wouldn't be a beneficiary. So it begins to automatically become a bit more passive definition of participation. By the 1990s, again, galloping very quickly, and excuse the broad generalizations, what had happened? There was the mainstreaming of participation. I was in the 1990s in meetings like this of NGOs around the world. It was called the NGO Forum on the World Bank. Some of you may remember. We were involved in trying to get the World Bank to pay attention to vulnerable choice people, and a huge network of NGOs like this. And we were successful to a degree. They picked up the words participation. Participation became mainstreamed. but the meaning of the word changed. In the mid-1990s, the very important document that mainstream participation said there should be participation of stakeholders and primary stakeholders. By primary stakeholders, they meant poor people themselves. That word got deleted. Participation became participation of all stakeholders in the processes of decision making. Now, what does that mean? Who's a stakeholder? A stakeholder can be the government, it can be private sector, it can be the NGO, it can be the people themselves. So that by that definition, according to somebody in the World Bank, I had lunch with, who told me, I had lunch with somebody from the National Association of NGOs, the National Chamber of Commerce, the Treasury, and we talked about the national plan, and therefore we had participation of all stakeholders. Right? It became a movement of stakeholder participation rather than people's participation. And then in response to that, very quickly, by the year 2000, we began to see kind of a pushback and the emergence in many NGOs of this notion of rights and a rights-based participation of rights-bearing citizens. And the notion of the right to participation then becomes very, very different from the stakeholder view or the beneficiary view. The right to participation, which is now being embodied in many UN and other global treaties and some national laws, makes participation a source of power, a legitimate demand, not something which can be invited, something which you can offer and then take away. So for me, I'm talking about participation as a right, not an invitation, a right that goes with all people, not simply as beneficiaries or stakeholders. And I think it's very important, if you're talking about strengthening the voices in your network, what meanings you have. Many NGOs began to talk then about the rights-based approach, where very quickly we moved from this notion of what do people need to what rights do they have, from beneficiaries to citizens, from thinking about community involvement, who's the community, to disaggregating that to focusing on the most vulnerable in the community, from talking about the symptoms of the problem to the underlying causes of the problem, from talking simply about reducing vulnerability to changing power. So again, this is very quick, but I would like to invite you in the strategies to think about where do you fit in your strategies on this spectrum. When we talk about participation, we also have to talk about how powerful is that participation. In my view, there's a difference, a fundamental difference between consultation and participation. Consultation means inviting people to say something as individuals, but doesn't involve any necessary responsibility of people to pay attention to that voice. But it's a starting place. So we can talk about how do we strengthen the voice of people but that becomes limited if we're not also talking about how that voice is heard. We can move from just voice to how do we talk about strengthening the direct participation of people in decision-making fora which affect their lives. So from voice to presence. But from voice to presence neither of those guarantee that there's influence. And if we're talking about participation, I think we need to be talking about moving up this ladder from voice to real influence. And where do we want that to happen? Well, oftentimes in situations like this, and in your mission statement, you said we're talking about involving people, the voices of people, in some big decision-making fora, the state, the national state, the global fora. That's very, very difficult for ordinary people to make that leap, because in between there's intermediary organizations, big civil society organizations, political parties, donors, others. So if we ask the question of how do we involve people from here to here, we arguably also have to say, how are they being involved in the NGOs themselves? How are they being involved in these intermediary structures themselves? Okay? So participation is a huge challenge of moving from voice to influence, not just in somebody else's arena, but in our own work as well.